Hello, this is Professor Lipey, and today the narration is going to be about behavior in groups and collectives. That is, how do people behave and what are the effects of being in a group or a bunch of people or just being in the mere presence of others. Okay, so a group, what we mean by that is a set of individuals having direct interaction with each other over time with a shared fate, identity, or goals. Okay? A collective involves people engaging in a common activity but having little direct interaction with each other. So in this narration, I'm going to sample and cover several important behavioral and attitudinal/cognitive responses that are associated with being in a group or a collective. So we'll look at some behavioral outcomes that can result from merely being in a collective. Okay, we'll talk about social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation. And then we will later talk about, in a second narration, some of the cognitive outcomes that require being in a group, okay, as opposed to merely a collective. Okay. So we'll talk about a little bit about brainstorming. We'll talk about group polarization. We'll talk a little bit about groupthink, an interesting term that most people are aware of, but you might not be specifically aware of what that term means and where it comes from. Okay, so why join a group? Okay, well, much of what we hope to accomplish requires collective action. Okay, we need to work together. We are in families for purposes of having a relationship, having children, etc. We get involved in athletic activities. Okay, there's many reasons to be in groups. Okay, or even in collectives. Okay. As we've seen in the past, we may have an innate need to belong, okay, and specifically to belong to the group, to belong to groups. Okay, so we've talked about, and the textbook talks about the social brain hypothesis, that basically we're wired in various ways to actually be attracted to being in groups, being with others. From an evolutionary and historical perspective, obviously, groups offered protection from physical threat. Okay, you're better off in a group than you are alone when you're confronting an enemy or a predator or something to that effect. Okay, and of course, we talked about social identity in various places in the course. Okay, being in a group that we value, okay, can increase our positive sense of social identity, and in turn our self-esteem. Okay, being without a group, okay, being facing the world alone, can have sort of negative effects on our sense of identity, okay, and our personal well-being. Okay. So one thing I wanted to talk about before we get into some of the specific qualities that we saw previously is the concept of group cohesiveness. Okay, the idea of cohesiveness. Okay, what we mean by cohesiveness when we're talking about groups, okay, is the extent to which the members of the group value their membership in the group. They're attracted to that group through feelings of liking, through feelings of unity, through feelings of commitment to group goals, intimacy, and so on. Okay, so the more the individuals are attracted to being in the group, okay, the greater the cohesiveness. Okay, so now cohesiveness has a lot to do with basically the extent to which the group can compel one to adhere to the norms or the values, okay, and the goals of the group, okay. When groups are cohesive, then um, there is a greater adherence to group norms and values. Groups that are not so cohesive, the members don't, basically, must work together, must be in a group for that group for a specific reason, but there isn't much attachment to the group when cohesiveness is low. We see a lot of deviation, a lot less, so shall we say, conformity to group norms and values, which is interesting from a work perspective, as industrial organizational psychologists have pointed out. Excuse me. If the group values good performance, if that's one of the values that members of the group hold collectively, okay, then the higher the cohesion, okay, the more the group attracts the individual, the greater the performance, okay. Groups that are not cohesive, okay, are not going to uh, be so much affected by this. If the group doesn't value good performance, okay, so so that's not one of the goals of the group. It's a work group, and the whole thing is to just do what you got to do, and let's be done with it. Okay, there's not a whole a productivity or a good performance value. Then the more cohesive that group is, the um, the less likely they are to perform well. Okay, so think about working for an organization and you belong to a group of people, maybe working, um, um, in a restaurant kind of setting or in a factory kind of setting, and you're part of a work group. And the group and the members of the group and the basically value and share the goals of the organization to do well, okay, to perform well, to get the work out and do it well, okay. Well, if those values of the organization of the company, for example, are shared by group individuals, then the greater the cohesiveness of the group, okay, uh, the better the performance is going to be. But if the group's values don't align with the company's, they don't value good performance, okay, they're not aligned with those kinds of um, goals, okay, then in fact the more friendship, the more cohesion there is within the group, actually it might cause a dip in performance, okay. So we tend to have, so there's this relationship, does group cohesiveness improve performance, okay, or does it hinder performance? Well, it depends on whether the values of the group are for performance, if you will, or against performance. Now, group performance, okay, so the idea here was that cohesiveness may be a cause of performance. Greater the cohesiveness, the more positive the goals are. If the goals are positive, the greater the performance. It's also possible that the opposite works, okay, so group performance can itself be a cause of cohesiveness. So performance might actually cause cohesiveness. So, for example, the group performs really, really well, okay? That's kind of rewarding to the members of the group, okay? And the individuals may come to value their membership in that group even more. So the good performance actually led the group to become more cohesive. So there's a study done a while ago that was actually a field experiment, an ingenious one, a long-term one, a field study, which basically studied this. Okay, this was what we could call the submarine study. So what the researchers were able to study was the performance of a team of various scientists and technicians and specialists, okay, in oceanography, who embarked on a 6-week mission during which they would be living alone and doing their research, oceanographic research, in a submarine, a submerged submarine. Okay, and some social scientists basically went along for the ride, if you will. Okay, and they basically studied, okay, the relationship between cohesiveness and performance. Um, in the first week the group was together, okay, and at the end of the excursion, in week 7, okay. So what the researchers measured, okay, so there were a number of studies that needed to be done and reports written, and you can look at performance, okay, in terms of how productive the group was, in terms of how many reports they produced, how much research they got done during each week. Okay, and you could also measure cohesiveness by basically asking individuals individually the extent to which they valued the others in the group and belonging to this this group of oceanographic researchers. Okay, so they measured these two things at week 1 and at week 7. So they measured cohesiveness, the extent to which the members were attracted to the group, were cohesive. Okay, uh, and they also measured performance at week 1 and week 2. Okay, and so what I have here, okay, so we have two measures at two different times. Okay, now let's look at some of the correlation that we found, the extent to which cohesiveness and performance were correlated with one another. Okay, well, so we've got 4 measures, measures A, B, C, and D. So the extent to which cohesiveness was a cause of performance in this time series analysis could be kind of assessed. Of course, it's not really an experiment, it's correlational, but by looking at cohesiveness at time 1 in terms of predicting performance at time 2, A and D, okay, it was found really that there was no relationship, okay, very little relationship, a minor relationship between cohesiveness and performance, okay, cohesiveness at time 1 and performance at time 2. So the cohesiveness measured at the beginning was not so highly correlated with performance measured at the end. But if we look at performance measured at the beginning, how good they were doing early on, and how cohesive they became, okay, we see a whopping correlation. Okay, so the higher the performance early on, the more cohesive the group became. Okay, that's the BC correlation, which is 0.72 on a -1 to +1 scale of correlation. So that is suggestive evidence that performance actually causes cohesiveness. By the time we get to week 7, cohesiveness and performance are very highly related. Okay, and a lot of it seems to have been driven by the fact that, you know, how well they performed early on was a good predictor of how cohesive they became. So this was good evidence. Okay, it's very suggestive evidence from a field study that was correlational, but involved a time series, that performance, the better a group performs, the more the group members may come to like being in the group, become cohesive. Okay, very interesting study. So the relationship can work both ways. Cohesiveness is often a cause of good performance. The more cohesive, the more better they perform. But performance can also be a cause of cohesiveness, leading to the same outcome of a high correlation. Okay, so it works both ways, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? If the group is enjoying a lot of success, it makes sense that they're going to become more cohesive. Okay, just as if a group is very cohesive to begin with, that may affect their performance and lead them to perform even better. So correlations in both directions. All right. So let's talk about the domains that I mentioned early on, okay? Beginning with social facilitation. Social facilitation, interesting term, okay? Being facilitated socially, okay? Uh, so when others arouse us is the subtitle I have here, okay? Let's see why, okay? So how does the mere presence of others affect our behavior? So we can go back a century and a quarter, okay, and actually I think this was talked way back at the beginning of the course as an example of very, very early research among the founders of social psychology. So Triplett did this research where he basically looked at one of the measures he used was one of the tasks he used was fishing reel. Okay, looking at how much how well people reeled in. Okay, using a fishing reel. Okay, so and he had people performing this task either alone, okay, or in the presence of another also performing the task, or in the presence of another simply watching, okay. And compared to alone, okay, the alone condition, members in the co-acting position, situation where you have two people reeling next to each other as hard and as fast as they can, or just being observed reeling, okay, the presence of others in both cases actually led to improved performance compared to doing the task alone. Hence, the term became social facilitation. The presence of others facilitates, makes easier, makes better, okay, performance, okay. So a number of studies supported that, and it actually, was kind of dropped as a research topic for a long time. But in recent years, and meaning in the 70s and 80s, okay, 1970s and 80s, this was taken another look at, okay. Um, Actually, it began in the 60s taking a look at this. And looking at the studies that had been done way back, okay, it suggests that the results were kind of triplets and others were kind of weak, not particularly strong, kind of inconclusive because they found that some of the research was showing either no effect, no social facilitation, or an anti-social facilitation effect, what we could call social inhibition. The presence of others actually reduced performance. Okay. By the way, some of the studies also involved, bicycle riding, bicycle races. Do you go faster if you're racing against the clock, or if there's a co-actor, okay, someone you're racing against, okay, or an audience watching you, okay. The studies found kind of mild support for the idea that, yeah, actually you bike faster, get faster times when others are present than when you're just racing against the clock. Okay, so that was another piece of evidence that kind of supported that. So that supported social facilitation, but only weakly, and then using other domains, okay, and other kinds of subjects, okay, basically one often found the opposite results, okay. So we had this conundrum when this research was looked at again, showing that in some studies you find social facilitation, in other studies you find no effect. In still other studies you find this negative effect, so that is we could call social inhibition or social negative facilitation, if you will. Okay, so more studies were done, and those studies also showed kind of mixed results. Okay, the presence of others sometimes enhances performance, sometimes produces a decline. So what was going on? So Bob Zients, okay, who was a social psychologist at the University of Michigan, okay, fairly famous one. I think we've seen him in other contexts, okay. Um, so Zients basically took all the research and kind of looked at it closely and re-examined it, and meta-analyzed it. And he basically came to a theoretical conclusion about what was going on. Okay, and it was a three-step process. So the three-step process goes this way. The presence of others kind of universally generates a general physiological arousal. When others are around, we tend to be more physiologically aroused. That energizes behavior. And by energizing behavior, the second step is that this enhances the tendency to perform the dominant response due to increased arousal. By this we mean the response that most spontaneously occurs, okay? Most spontaneously comes to mind, okay? And the dominant response, okay, really can be the right response or it can be the wrong response, okay? So the third step is that it results in a quality of performance that varies according to the type of task, okay? So here's the science solution. Presence of another person or member of the same species, because you see social facilitation in basically all across the animal kingdom as well. Okay, we see increased arousal. Okay, strength and dominant response. So if it's an easy task, okay, then the correct response is likely to be the one that's dominant. Okay, it's an easy task. That suggests that the response easily comes to the fore. Okay, so if that gets energized, that dominant response on an easy task is the correct response, then you're going to do even better on an easy task in the presence of others. But if it's a difficult task, arousal can interfere with performance, and the dominant response may not be the correct response. Okay, in fact, it's likely not to be. So we're going to get performance impairment. Okay, when the task is difficult. Okay, so we get this kind of depending on whether the dominant response is the correct response or the incorrect response, we're going to get either social facilitation here, okay, or social inhibition, okay, performance impairment over here, okay, when the task is difficult. And you can see this. I mean, if you're doing something that isn't really well learned, okay, that's really, really hard, okay, and difficult, and you're going to require a lot of training. Well, why do you need a lot of training? Because your initial responses are not going to be the correct response, okay? So if you're not an expert and well-practiced, say, third baseman in baseball, okay, you know, then having somebody watching you, such as an audience, okay, and a hard hit ball down the line, okay, you know, you might fumble around. Your response might not be to, you know, to move in the right way with the glove in the right position automatically, and you might do worse in the presence of others, okay, than when you're alone, okay, doing it alone. Whereas if you're an expert, okay, you know, then you know, the audience might actually improve your performance. Okay, so arousal has these kinds of effects. Okay, it's going to interfere um, with responses with tasks that are really difficult and you haven't really well learned them, and it's going to help on responses that are easy tasks. Okay, or well learned tasks. Okay, so that's social facilitation. Okay. Uh, okay, so now basically, social facilitation, I'll just move to this, is really kind of universal, okay? It occurs in humans and animals, even insects, okay? Zions did research basically with cockroaches, basically demonstrating social facilitation in a pretty primitive species, right? So most people know, we've been through this and through that, if 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 you have a cockroach, okay, let's say there's been a cockroach in the kitchen, okay, you turn on the light, okay, you see a cockroach, and the minute you turn the light on, the cockroach scurries away, okay, fast as can be, okay. It's like the light basically triggers this automatic get to the dark, okay, response to the cockroach, okay. Now, that's a dominant response, okay. So, and it's basically you know, a straight line, a straight beeline away from the light, okay. So Zions designed a study in which he put a cockroach in a maze, okay, not in a maze, uh, in a runway, okay, with the start box on one side, and at the other end of the runway is a dark enclosure that the cockroach can kind of get to, okay. And then what he did was he would in the start box he would turn on a light, okay, a bright light, and the cockroach would immediately kind of run to the other side, to the dark, okay, to the dark end box, okay, the goal box, if you will, okay. And he studied how fast would a cockroach run, okay, to the dark from the light, okay, alone, and he measured that. And then he had a double runway in which two cockroaches, okay, are experiencing the same thing. How fast would those cockroaches run, okay, if there's another cockroach uh, co-acting with the cockroach in a separate runway? And what he found was, okay, they actually run faster, okay, if there's another cockroach. And that's true even if the cockroach is, so to speak, an audience. Yeah, the cockroach is in little, boxes beside the runway. Okay, when they were there, the cockroach ran faster than when the cockroach was alone. Okay, so we see the social facilitation. That's a dominant response. Now notice the dominant response is to run, okay, away from the light. Just make a beeline. Okay. Now that wouldn't be the right response if the cockroach was like in a maze where you had to make some turns, okay, to get to the dark, to get to the goal box, okay. So he set the same thing up, except that now to get away from the light, the cockroach has to make several turns, okay. It's a maze, okay. And what was found there was that the cockroaches do worse in the presence of others, okay, than alone, okay. Um, so we see the negative effect, okay, when it's a complex task and the dominant response is wrong. The dominant response is just, scurry, okay. Well, the cockroach is going to run into a wall, make the wrong turn, etc., and that's going to slow them down, okay. So that's an interesting kind of phenomenon, but and it's a very primitive organism, okay, but you can see, okay, it's a good example of social facilitation and the dominant response. When the dominant response is the right response, and social inhibition when it's the wrong response, okay. So we see a lot of social facilitation effects all the time in people, okay, uh, associated with arousal and the difficulty of the task. Arousal itself, okay, is we can see, even without the presence of people, if you're aroused, arousal is going to actually increase your performance on a task that's well learned and inhibit your performance on a task that is not well learned. Okay, so people who experience a lot of test anxiety, okay, so they confront a test and it's a difficult exam, they don't really know the material as well as perhaps they could, okay, and that test anxiety actually makes them perform worse because the dominant responses, your head's muddled from the arousal, the dominant responses to these questions are not the right responses, okay? And so you make a lot more errors. But if you really have the material nailed, okay, it's really, really well learned, test anxiety actually can improve one's performance, okay? It all has to do with arousal, and the presence of people create arousal. Okay, this is a great example. In fact, I think I'll show it just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. It's going to make it a little. All right. Going to make the narration a little longer, but I think it's worth it.
This is Go! Nothing can stop me. I'm all the way up. All the way up. I'm all the way up. I'm all the way up. Nothing can stop me. I'm all the way up. Shorty, what you want? Shorty, what you need? My niggas run the game. We ain't never leave. Counting up this money. We ain't never sleep. You got V12. I got 12 V's. Got bottles. Got weed. Got my. I'm all the way up. Shorty, what you want? I got what you need. Shorty, what you want? I got what you need. Shorty, what you want? I got what you need.
Have you played basketball before you came to college and high school, per se?
Of course. You know, ever since I could walk, I was pretty much dribbling. Played in high school, tore it up all the time.
So, Craig, how confident would you say you are on your basketball skills?
Scale of 1 to 10, 15.
So you would say that definitely with more people watching you, you perform better?
I think so. I think when people are around me, and yeah, I kind of do better when I have people watching me and looking at me, so I can show the ice in my veins.
Do you think Craig is going to do better or worse with people watching him?
Craig is definitely going to do worse. He has a tendency to not be able to handle the heat.
Okay, so science would say that with people watching, since he's played before, he's going to do better. What's your response to that?
Screw science. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but, you know, we'll see what science has to say about this.
Craig, you're the worst.
Me and your mom were talking about you last night, and guess what? We both think you suck!
You're really wearing an Indiana jersey right now, dude.
So, Craig, you ended up being right. You shot way better with people watching you. Did the presence of others, did you feel it at all? Did it affect you at all?
Yeah, just having people in the gym, having people with me, and then having people actually right there in front of my face helped me a lot.
You ready? Let's go. Yeah.
Lexi, have you ever played basketball before?
I have not. No.
So do you think that you're going to do better with people watching you or without people watching you?
I think I'll probably do worse because I don't like having people watch me. I kind of get freaked out, so probably worse.
So do you think Lexi's going to do better or worse with people watching her?
I don't know. She's pretty new to the sport. I don't know if people that are watching her probably will make it worse.
Your fashion sense directly correlates to your basketball skills. That's horrible.
You just have no style.
You're no good.
So Lexi, you were also right. With more people watching you, you went 0 for 10. Do you think the people being there watching you really made a difference? Did you feel their presence?
Yes, I did. I got really nervous because I didn't want to look bad, so I got nervous. I freaked out. I think I choked a little bit.
Okay. Well, so there you have it. Lessons from the basketball court. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Okay. So there are a number of reasons for social facilitation and social inhibition as we've seen them. So Zion's explanation is mere presence, right? Okay, the mere presence of others produces social facilitation because it arouses us physiologically, if you will. Okay, evaluation apprehension is another possibility. The presence of others produce social facilitation effects when those, especially when those others are seen as potential evaluators. Okay, that's when we get the effect being really strong, as in watching Lexi, or the other guy actually being at the free throw line with them. Okay, there's also distraction conflict idea that actually the presence of other people basically is distracting. Okay, and so for distraction from the task, you got this attentional conflict going on. Okay, you're not going to do as well on a difficult task because you need to be focusing, but on an easy task, you don't really need to be focusing. And so, actually, if you go on more on automatic with that, you're going to do even better. Okay, so those are a couple additional theories. About social facilitation. So the latter two factors may be viewed as enhancers of the effects that arousal itself produces. All right, so let's move on to social loafing. Okay, so social loafing again begins with studies that were long forgotten and then picked up many years later, where a scientist named Ringelmann, a century and a quarter ago, or almost a century and a third, but if you will, basically did these studies where he had uh, men basically engaging in a kind of a tug of war contest. Okay, uh, so that you have a rope attached to a resistance kind of uh, mechanism where you can pull it, and it's very hard to pull. And the harder you pull, the more the mechanism records how much effort, how much energy you put into it. Okay. And Ringelmann found that when people were pulling it alone, okay, um, they were actually put out more than when they were in a group of like 3 people, okay, so, who are lined up one behind the other with the rope, like in a tug of war, okay. And how well would the 3 people do, okay, as opposed individually as opposed to one person, okay. So in the 3-person group, you would expect output should be 3 times as much if you got 3 people than if a person is doing it alone. Okay, but what one really found was that what the results showed was that individual output declines when people thought that they were actually doing the task with others. Okay, so rather than 3 times the output, we got like 2 times the output. Okay, that 3 people produce compared to 1. Okay, so that is the idea of social loafing. Okay, um, social loafing occurs when the specific performance of any one individual really can't be determined. Okay, so this got picked up again when back in the 70s and 80s when researchers became interested in basically it became known as social impact theory about just what are the various kinds of variables that influence our performance associated with the impact of others. Okay, and that led to basically the concept of social loafing. Okay, a group produced reduction in individual output on easy tasks in which contributions are pooled. Okay, so here's some research that was done by Bibb Latané and his then students, Kip Williams and Steve Harkins. Latané had this theory called social impact theory, okay? And he did these really interesting experiments they did. Actually, I have a lot of familiarity with the original research because this was being done when I was in graduate school in Ohio State, where Bibb Latané was and his students, and I remember the lab in which they had set up this this kind of setting and procedure for studying social loafing. So he would have people in this large room, okay, either alone or with others, okay, and they would be what's measured, okay, is the sound pressure per person, okay, that's being the sound pressure that's being put out by whatever activity is being engaged in, okay. And in one study it was cheering, in another study it was clapping. So people are asked to, on cue, okay, clap, okay, as hard as you can, do as much clapping and as loud as you can, okay, and you can measure how well, okay, how much sound pressure is produced, okay. So it was found that when people are doing it alone, I forget what the exact metric was, but in the clapping study, you can see a single person puts out this much sound pressure, okay, on average, and in the cheering study, about this much sound pressure. But what happens when you have 2 people, okay, cheering or clapping at the same time? Here then you see per person the output declines. And if we get a group size of 4 people clapping or cheering at the same time, we don't have 4 times as much sound pressure. We have considerably less, okay, per person, okay. So the per person sound pressure declines as the group size increases, okay. And in fact, I thought I had another slide there. I guess I didn't. So you might say, well, that's because, you get they can't be all clapping simultaneously, and you get, production. You get some loss because they're not all doing it at the same time. Maybe that's what accounts for it. Well, that doesn't account for it because then they did research where people in a room together, okay, and they're basically told, okay, on cue, you cheer as loud as you can, and until you're going to be the only person cheering, okay, and you get your measure. Then you can have tell people that, okay, I want all 3 of you, let's say, to cheer, okay, when the cue comes, okay. And so you think that 3 people are cheering all together, okay? But in fact, only one person actually got the cue to cheer, okay? I mean, only one person actually, got the cue to cheer, okay? But the person thinks that there are 3 people cheering with him, 2 other people cheering with him. And that's enough, just knowing that other people are cheering with you, your performance declines, okay? So this is the social loafing phenomenon on these very simple tasks, okay? Now, why does social loafing occur? There's been other kinds of paradigms that have been used, like there have been studies in which people are given pieces of paper and they're asked to make paper airplanes out of them, okay, according to a certain, set of instructions, and do it as fast as they can, okay, do as many as they can, and then throw them into a big bowl in the middle of the room, okay. And you can measure how fast can people do this? How many can they do in 5 minutes, okay? And then you have them do the same task, except you got 3 people doing it, okay. And at the end, you can measure how many paper airplanes are in that box, okay. Now you'd think that we know, let's say people can do 10 of them in 5 minutes, okay. So you should see, if 3 people are doing it, you should see, 30 of them, okay. But you don't. You end up seeing like 22, 23, okay. There's this social loafing. People aren't putting out as much, okay. So it's motivational. Consciously or unconsciously, we put less into a task if, okay, our output is anonymous. We're not identifiable, so no one can tell how much of this input is yours, okay. You're going to share equally in any rewards no matter how much we produce. So if you're getting rewarded for how many paper airplanes you make, okay, and you're completely anonymous, as is your input, it's all the same thing being thrown into a box, okay, no one knows whose is which. Well, if there's 6 of you, you're going to get 1 out of 6. You're going to get 1/6 of the rewards, okay. That means that you can loaf a little, okay, you can kind of let up a little, and you're still going to get 1/6 of it, okay. You're going to get this, basically, you're going to share equally no matter how much you produce, okay. So it's anonymous, okay. Rewards are not tied to you specifically, okay. You can kind of take a free ride on the effort of others if the task is not important, okay. So those are 3 conditions. We put less into a task if these 3 conditions are met, okay. Well, why does that happen, okay? Well, basically, there are a couple of models. One is the collective effort model. People try hard on a collective task when they think their efforts will help them achieve outcomes they personally value. So you might not loaf if the outcome that the group is moving toward is something that's really important to you. If the outcome is important, you believe one can help achieve the desired outcome, then you're not likely to loaf. You might actually engage in social compensation, doing more than your share because you really value that outcome. But if the outcome is not important, or you feel unable to compensate enough for, the idea that others might in the group might be socially loafing, then you're going to loaf and you're going to exert less effort, sometimes known as the sucker effect. Now, social loafing is less likely to occur when we believe our performances can be identified and evaluated, okay? When the task is important, as we've seen, and when we believe my performance really matters, okay? My performance is necessary for a successful outcome, okay? So I'm not gonna loaf, okay? If I'm, one of a defensive lineman on a football team, I'm not going to put any effort into blocking because my ability to block, the block the guys coming at me, definitely is important for the outcome of the passer having enough time to get the throw off. So we're not going to load when we see our efforts as necessary for the successful outcome. We tend not to loaf. Okay, if there's a specific group goal to be reached. Okay, so reducing social loafing. How to get everyone to contribute to your group project? Well, so when the task is undifferentiated, the roles are the same. You got to keep your group small and cohesive. Give it a goal. Now, when you got a group project and you can divide the tasks into different tasks, limit the scope of the project, break large projects into smaller components, use peer evaluations, make people identifiable, make each member a manager, okay, so that how well they perform, okay, really contributes to the larger task in terms of the segment they're responsible for. So, little lessons about how to avoid social loafing, which students have told me for a number of years could be an issue with group projects. Okay, culture and social loafing. Okay, we see that women loaf less than men. Okay, loafing is less prevalent in collectivist cultures. Okay, than individualistic ones. Okay. But in a collectivist culture, if the group basically does not have a high productivity value, okay, you can actually get a large amount of social loafing because, again, the group is more central in a collectivist kind of culture. All right, final thing to talk about in this is de-individuation, okay? So what's de-individuation? This is the loss of a person's sense of individuality, the reduction of normal constraints against deviant behavior. So examples, okay? I don't know if anybody's ever experienced a suicide jump scene. I have only once when I was a doctoral student in Ohio State. Someone jumped off the top of Ohio Stadium. But I was just coming out of my office, which was in the stadium at the time, and not too many people were there to bait and jeer. But you do find that if people are threatening to jump, okay, you especially as it gets darker and it's been there longer, you end up finding people baiting and jeering, okay, at the person, things that they wouldn't do if they were alone. If a crowd develops, okay. You would never bait the person or jeer at a person who's about to kill themselves, okay, when you were alone. But nevertheless, you get that in a crowd scene like that, okay. So it depends on crowd size. The bigger the crowd, the more likely the nighttime as well. After things warm up at a party, okay, you're kind of disinhibited, okay. Your sense of individuality tends to go down and deviant behavior becomes more likely. At sporting events, people say things and shout things and scream things and do things that you never would do, okay, alone, okay, or in a small group, okay. But this big a crowd where you feel anonymous and the norms of the crowd are basically becoming blurred, okay. You get your de-individuation effects, okay. So here's another video. It's a short one, so we can deal with it a little bit here. Okay, that looks like it.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
It's crazy.
De-individuation is the loss of self-awareness and restraint that can occur in group situations. They become less of an individual and more anonymous. In a sense, people will do things in a group they otherwise would not because they feel less responsible for their actions and less like an individual. Masks, sunglasses, hats, and other apparel help hide an individual's identity, which makes them feel unidentifiable. Also, sunglasses can support aggressive attitudes as they hide the eyes. When a person cannot be identified, they tend to lose responsibility for their actions. Now let's take a look at the Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl celebration. People tend to act on the basis of immediate emotions and motivations without considerations that might otherwise prevent the behavior. Lacking ordinary consciousness, fans tear up their seats, they throw things, they start fires, and they rush the field. People can even be trampled, burned, beaten, and killed. Eagles fans rushed the streets and quickly became reckless and violent. A few of these clips show how fans can lose their identity within a large mass. Vandalism was a common occurrence in downtown Philly.
Explain myself. You said you care for me, said you be there for me, murder on the beat. You said you care for me, said you be there for me, you said you got for me,
Bye, have a beautiful time.
Okay, so that's an example of de-individuation, okay? And we can think, I'm sure, very many examples, okay? So one of the things that has to do, that is involved in de-individuation is anonymity, okay? When you're anonymous, you can't be identified. That lends itself, that's how crowds lend themselves to de-individuation effects because people feel anonymous, okay? So here's a study that I think is talked about in your textbook, so I'll be brief about it. So this is another one of those trick or treat studies that we saw in other contexts when looking at the self-concept and self-awareness. So here's a same situation where researchers looked at when they were they left during Halloween on the front porch a bowl of candy out. Told had the instruction you should just take one, save some for others, and then they looked at the percentage of the trick or treaters who cheated, and they looked at whether they were alone, okay, or whether in a group of kids, okay, and also whether or not they were anonymous, they were in a masked, they were in costume and mask, or they were very much not anonymous. And you should see that both anonymity, okay, increased, okay. So when you're alone and you're not anonymous, okay, versus anonymous, okay, well, being anonymous, okay, even when you're alone, it's going to increase your tendency to do a little cheating here, okay. And here you can see that in the group, okay, well, you can see just being in the group when you're not anonymous increases your cheating, if you will, taking extra candy. But if you're both anonymous and in a group, okay, you see a lot of de-individuation in the sense that you can't be identified, you're lost among a group, and you're not anonymous. You get all kinds of very high level of well, in this case, cheating behavior, if you will. Okay, so what contributes to de-individuation? Okay, well, arousal. Okay, when we're aroused, we're not thinking, in the presence of others is energizing kind of, dominant thoughts that may go along with what's going on with the rest of the people. Okay, so arousal has that effect. Anonymity, reduced feelings of individual responsibility, the presence of accountability cues, and the presence of what we could call attentional cues. So if we look at situational cues, okay, so accountability cues affect the person's cost-reward calculations. Okay, so if we're not accountable, we may deliberately engage in gratifying but usually inhibited behaviors. So in a group, in a crowd, okay, when we don't feel accountable for our actions, that makes it more likely, since we're part of a larger collective, okay, that's a cue toward sort of engaging in these normally inhibited behaviors, okay. Attentional cues basically focus our attention away from the self, okay, to get out of self-awareness. So when we're in a crowd, when we're in a situation that in which the norms are being violated, okay, we're going to be able to and less likely to attend to our internal standards of conduct, okay, and we're going to be reacting more to the immediate situation, okay. So there's this loss of self-awareness and being, attention being drawn to what's going on in the crowd, okay. So we react more to this immediate situation. We're not thinking about our own values, our own our own norms about acknowledgement of norms, okay. And we're going to be less sensitive to the long-term consequences of the behavior to the self, okay. So basically, there's a loss of personal identity that can contribute to the antisocial behavior that occurs associated with de-individuation, okay. But there's also basically a linkage, okay, to social identity. Okay, so basically, if we're in a particular group that is doing a particular set of things, okay, as our personal identity and internal controls get submerged by the ambiance, by the total kind of crazy situation going on, social identity emerges, okay, and we become more likely to conform to what this group we happen to be, or collective that we happen to be, part of at the moment, okay. So, so we see we lose personal identity. Identity moves toward whatever group or collective, okay, we tend to be associated with in the moment, okay. A football crowd, okay, a group of rowdy people behaving at a party, okay. So the consequences of losing your personal identity sort of depends on what you lose it to. What's the social identity you're moving toward as we lose our personal identity, okay? And so here is a fascinating experiment done a while back, which is a very interesting demonstration of this phenomenon. This is actually research that Phil Zimbardo did, I believe, a number of years ago. And so basically, this is like your the paradigm in which you're trying to you're evaluating the performance of another person, their essay, responses they're given, and you basically, in kind of a Milgram-esque kind of way, not quite that not this escalation of shocks, but you basically are trying to teach the person something, or reward the person or punish the person, okay, for their responses, okay, and the punishment would be shock levels. And you have options in terms of, how often you shock, and in terms of response to a response, and what level within a limited range you give, okay. And so the participants are doing this in a group, okay, and they're either anonymous. Everybody's wearing kind of like a KKK. No. We'll get to the KKK in a second. They're either anonymous, okay, so their names are not known, okay. You don't know who's, you haven't given your name, you're not identifiable. Or, okay, you have been identified by name, the experimenter knows who you are, everybody, so you're identified, okay. And if people are either dressed in a KKK costume, and of course that's a situational cue. That kind of social identity is associated with what? Violence, right? Violence and hatred, okay. Or people are dressed in nurses' uniforms, okay, which is associated, which we're copying a social identity associated with helping, okay, pro-social kinds of things, okay. And so what we find is that when people are in a KKK costume, okay, you see a high shock level. That's the cue to be kind of, that social identity. You're kind of like in some superficial way at least, but giving into, because you're in a KKK costume, okay, you're more likely you deliver lots and lots of shock, okay, high shock levels, okay. If you are in a nurse's uniform, participants were in a group in a nurse's uniform, okay, even if they were when they were identifiable, okay, you see that you have much less shock, okay, the social identity is pro-social, okay. But you'd think that would be particularly the case if people are identifiable, but no, if you're anonymous, okay, you kind of can get lost in that new identity, okay, and the cue associated with the nurse's uniform, and you're very, very unlikely, okay, to basically deliver much shock, okay. So it's like you lost your personal identity by sort of being, all dressed the same way and being given the same kind of task and watching what other people are doing. But you've given in your identity by being anonymous to this pro-social social identity at the moment, based on the cue that what you're wearing, and you basically, this de-individuation actually led to a pro-social kind of outcome. Bottom line being, okay, it depends on the situation when we're de-individuated, how we're going to perform, okay? And most situations involving de-individuation basically send us down the wrong track because, the pro-social norms are kind of like submerged by what's going on, and the behavior is more antisocial. Okay, so anyways, it's a very important and interesting kind of concept to show how a crowd can go rogue and can go bad. Okay, and some of the social psychology behind that. What was I going to say? Anonymity decreases antisocial behavior, exclamation point. It encouraged identification with the group with the pro-social norm. Yep, that's what I wanted to say. Okay, and we're done, okay, for now. So we'll see you next time. I'm going to follow this up with another well, I hope I'm done. I lost it. Anyways, we'll see you next time for the second of 2 videos on groups and collectives.